Broadcast went live at 0347 station time, and I was already at my desk. I had not slept. I rarely did in those last weeks. 11 years of projection work sharpened certain instincts into something closer to a physical sense. A pressure behind the sternum, tightness in the jaw that you learn not to dismiss. I had been feeling it for 18 days. I had written it into my forecast log on each of those 18 mornings. Varek diplomatic posture has entered terminal escalation window. Probability of hostile unilateral action within current quarter, 91%. And fleet authorization be moved to active standby. My supervisor had initialed each one. The chain above him had done the same. Nobody needed convincing anymore. We had all been reading the same numbers for a long time. The broadcast opened with the Varek Dominion's ceremonial tonal signature, 17, descending notes that their culture used to mark a pronouncement of final authority. I recognized it immediately. So did the three analysts still on shift beside me. We said nothing. We turned our chairs toward the main display, and we watched. They had our delegation on a dais, all 17 of them. The full diplomatic mission, including First Speaker Aldrich Venn, who had given 31 years of his life to building kind of a careful, patient dialogue that was supposed to make this moment impossible. They were standing. They were not restrained. That detail, I think, was deliberate. The Varek wanted it understood that our people had no reason to run, because they did not yet know what was about to happen. The Dominion's High Arbiter stepped forward and delivered 11 sentences in the Varek formal register. I will not translate them here. The official record contains the full text. What matters is the final sentence, which the ISB translators rendered as: the species designated human is hereby reclassified from recognized diplomatic peer to client species, effective at the close of this transmission. This notice requires no response and permits none. Then they executed all 17. The display went dark. I sat for perhaps 4 seconds. Then I picked up my console, opened the forecast file I had been maintaining for 11 years, and typed the final entry. Triggering event confirmed, 0347, initiating closeout protocol. I sent it up the chain, flagged urgent. The response came back in 9 minutes. Not a question, not a request for assessment. Just 2 words from the director's terminal. Clock running. What followed was not chaos. That is the part that people outside the ISB find difficult to understand when I describe it. There was no shouting. There was no grief, not in those first hours. Grief is a luxury that requires stillness, and we had no stillness to spare. What there was, instead, was procedure. 11 years of procedure, activated in sequence, each step releasing the next like tumblers in a lock. By 0400, the fleet authorization had cleared the first 3 command tiers. By 0430, it had cleared all of them. By 0500, the ardent silence was receiving its launch coordinates. I want to be precise about what the ardent silence was, because it has been described in ways that flatten it into something simpler than the truth. It was not assembled in response to the broadcast. It was not a reaction. The ardent silence was 340 warships that had been built in secret over 11 years, in 6 separate dry docks across 4 different systems, under 7 different procurement classifications, specifically because my team's projections had indicated, with a confidence interval that tightened every quarter, that the Varek Dominion was moving toward an act that would require exactly this kind of answer. We built it before the offense. We built it because we knew the offense was coming. We could not have known the precise form it would take. The broadcast, the dais, the 17 descending notes. But we knew the weight of it. We had always known the weight. The Varek called their transmission a civilizational notice. They believed it required no response. They were wrong about that, in a way that no living member of their species would be able to explain afterward. I was not supposed to be on the courier ship. My assignment was the analysis floor, post-event assessment, damage modeling, projected Varek counter-responses. But the director approved my request without much argument, I think, because she understood that I had spent 11 years building the case for this moment, and that something in me required seeing it through to its conclusion. Not for satisfaction. I want to be careful about that word. What I needed was closure in the strictest sense. The closing of a loop that I had opened on a Tuesday morning 11 years earlier, when I had first run the Varek trajectory numbers and written in my initial report. If current expansion vectors hold, this civilization will eventually force a response that cannot be diplomatic in nature. Recommend long-range contingency planning begin immediately. Long-range contingency. That was what we had called it then. It seemed like a clinical phrase for what it eventually became. Courier ship positioned itself at the Varek system's outer transit boundary at 1820, the day after the broadcast. The ardent silence came out of transit 14 minutes later. There is a particular quality to the sight of 340 warships. Emerging from transit in formation, it is not loud. The vacuum ensures that. But the visual has a weight to it that I find difficult to articulate. The way the hulls caught the light of the Varek primary star, the wedge shapes resolving out of transit shimmer in sequence, one after another, until the formation filled the viewport from edge to edge, and still they were coming. The fleet had been organized into 7 strike groups, each one larger than anything the Varek Dominion had ever classified as a credible threat. Together they constituted something the Varek had no category for. I had noted that gap in my projections years earlier. Varek threat modeling does not account for preemptive construction at this scale. They will have no doctrinal response. That note had been marked interesting and filed. I had always found it somewhat more than interesting. The fleet's opening transmission to the Varek Dominion was brief. I had been consulted on its language. It named the offense, the execution, broadcast, the 17 dead, first speaker Ven's name given in full, and it named the response. The ardent silence, its composition, its intent. It contained no ultimatum, because an ultimatum implies a condition that can be met. There was no condition. There was only the statement of what had been done and what was now going to follow from it. The Varek High Arbiter's reply came 43 minutes later. It used their formal register. It invoked 3 separate Dominion legal frameworks. It demanded to know by what authority Earth had positioned a fleet in Varek sovereign space. The ardent silence fleet commander sent a single line in response. I wrote that line too. I had written it 8 years earlier and revised it exactly once. It read, "The authority is the broadcast. It requires no further explanation and permits none." We borrowed their language. I thought it was important to do that. I wanted there to be no ambiguity about what we were reflecting back at them. The engagement lasted 4 days. I will not describe the tactical details here. They are in the record for those who require them. What I will say is that the ardent silence performed exactly as projected. The Varek had built their defensive doctrine around the assumption that any opposing force would require time to mobilize, time to debate, time to grieve. They had not accounted for an enemy who had been grieving in advance, slowly, quietly, over 11 years of probability curves, and who had finished grieving before the offense was even committed. We had mourned our dead before they were dead. We had built our answer before the question was asked. By the time first speaker Ven stood on that dais, the war that would answer his death was already built and crewed and waiting at the edge of Varek, space. On the morning of the 5th day, I opened a new forecast file. I typed the date, the subject header, and then one line in the assessment field. Varek Dominion, no longer a factor in regional threat modeling. I saved it. I marked it closed. Outside the courier ship's viewport, the Varek primary star was rising over the terminator of its 3rd planet, and the light was very clear. And the ardent silence's hulls were still catching it, formations intact, 340 ships holding station, as the long silence they had been named for. Finally, completely settled. I did not feel what I had expected to feel. I felt the thing I had been trained to feel, which was nothing in particular. And then I felt something beneath that, old and quiet, which was the particular grief of a person who was right about something they had very much wished to be wrong about. I closed the file. I began the next one. That is the work.